I am writing this from a detention cell on Dralith Prime, and I need you to understand that every word of what follows is the truth. My name is Vathar Sokan, and 6 months ago, I commanded the finest strike fleet in the Dralith Dominion, 42 warships under my banner, 8 years without a single defeat. I burned 3 human colony worlds in 4 days, and I thought I was winning a war. I was not winning anything. I was walking into a trap so vast and so patient that it had been waiting for someone like me for 80 years. But I will begin where it began, with fire falling on a world called Elysium Reach, because that is where I made the first mistake that cost my people everything. The bombardment lasted 11 minutes. My gunnery officers executed their firing solutions with the precision I had drilled into them across dozens of campaigns, and the orbital defense grid around Elysium Reach folded like wet paper. I stood on the command bridge of my flagship, the Talon of Sovereignty, and watched through the magnified tactical display as human structures crumbled under our energy lances. Agricultural domes shattered, mining facilities collapsed into the craters we carved beneath them, communication towers snapped and fell in cascades of sparking metal. It was clean work, efficient and overwhelming, exactly the kind of operation that earns commendations and promotions in the Dominion military. And yet something was wrong. The humans were not fighting back, not in any meaningful way. A few ground-based point defense batteries had opened fire during the initial approach, spitting out streams of kinetic rounds that splashed harmlessly against our shields. But those went silent within the first 3 minutes. No warships launched from the surface, no orbital guns rotated to track our formation. The colony simply absorbed our fire and burned, and the only traffic leaving the planet was a ragged stream of civilian evacuation shuttles climbing through the smoke on desperate trajectories. I let them go. My orders from High Command were explicit on this point. Grand Admiral Torvin Dryal had made it clear that the objective was infrastructure denial, not population elimination. We wanted the resources these colonies produced. We wanted to cripple humanity's frontier supply chain before launching the broader territorial offensive that the Dominion Council had been planning for 3 years. Killing civilians would invite censure from the Galactic Assembly and complicate the political narrative. So the shuttles fled, and we let them, and my officers cheered as the last major structure on Elysium Reach collapsed into rubble. I did not cheer. I stood at the tactical rail and watched the evacuation shuttles disappear into the dark, and I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the recycled air on the bridge. The humans had barely resisted. Elysium Reach was listed in our intelligence files as a Category 3 settlement, meaning moderate population, significant agricultural output, and minimal military presence. But minimal did not mean zero. There should have been something: a garrison, a militia, even armed civilians making a futile stand. Humans were known throughout the galactic community for their stubbornness in combat, their refusal to yield ground without extracting a cost. Every intelligence briefing I had ever read about their species emphasized this single trait above all others. Humans fight. It is what they do. It is what they have always done. But Elysium Reach did not fight. It simply burned. I pushed the unease aside and ordered my fleet to the second target. We reached Kovacs Landing in 9 hours, jumping through 2 intermediary systems to avoid the main shipping lanes. Kovacs Landing was a mining colony, heavier on industrial infrastructure, and I expected at least a token resistance from whatever security forces were stationed there. There was nothing. The colony's shields activated briefly, held for perhaps 90 seconds under our bombardment, and then failed. The same pattern repeated itself with eerie precision. Civilian shuttles launched in orderly waves. Ground batteries fired a few desperate volleys and went quiet. The streets below were empty before our first lance even struck the surface, as if the population had been waiting for us. Bags packed, routes memorized, and my fleet reduced another human settlement to smoking rubble, without losing a single ship, without taking a single casualty, without encountering anything that could reasonably be called opposition. My intelligence officer, Leoness Keth, was the first to articulate what I was already feeling. She came to my quarters after the Kovacs Landing operation and stood before my desk with her data tablet pressed against her chest and her tail curled tight around her left ankle, which among our people is a sign of deep anxiety. "Commander," she said, "this is too easy." I told her that easy was the point. Grand Admiral Dryal had selected these targets specifically because they were soft, Frontier colonies with minimal defenses. Low-hanging fruit, as the humans themselves would say. Keth shook her head. I have reviewed the sensor logs from both operations in detail. At Elysium Reach and at Kovacs Landing, there was a structure in each colony that destroyed itself before we could scan it. Small, buried deep underground, heavily shielded against orbital detection. The same architecture at both sites, down to the alloy composition and power signature. These were not standard colonial facilities, Commander. They were purpose-built. They were something else. I asked her what she thought they were. Communication relays, she said, designed to send a specific signal at the exact moment of attack. Not a distress call, not a request for reinforcement. Something targeted, something directional, aimed at coordinates that do not correspond to any known human military installation or populated system. The humans prepared these colonies for bombardment, Commander, not to defend against it, to report it. I considered this for a long moment, then I dismissed it. Of course the colonies had communication equipment. Of course they would send distress signals when attacked. That was standard procedure for any settlement under bombardment. Earth was months away at standard faster-than-light speeds. Whatever message those relays had sent, it would take time to reach anyone who could act on it. And by then, we would hold all 7 target colonies and have fortified our positions beyond any reasonable counterattack threshold. Keth was a brilliant officer, but brilliance sometimes saw patterns where none existed. She did not look convinced, but she accepted my reasoning, with the tight-lipped silence of someone who knows they have said what they needed to say and cannot make their commander listen. She returned to her station. I ordered the fleet to proceed to our 3rd target, a world called Briar Shelf. Briar Shelf fell in 8 minutes. The same pattern, the same absence of meaningful resistance, the same self-destructing underground bunker, the same orderly civilian evacuation, the shuttles launching in tight formation, as if they had rehearsed this exact scenario. The same silence where there should have been defiance. 3 colonies burned, and I had not lost a single crew member. In the officers' mess that evening, my senior commanders celebrated. Drinks were poured from bottles that had been saved for exactly this kind of occasion. Toasts were raised to the glory of the Dominion and the weakness of humanity's frontier defenses. The mood was jubilant, triumphant, bordering on euphoric. We had struck 3 targets in rapid succession, neutralized their infrastructure, and suffered 0 losses. By any military metric, the campaign was a resounding success. I sat among them and smiled at the appropriate moments, and said the appropriate words, but the coldness in my chest had not gone away. It had deepened into something closer to dread, something I could not articulate, could not justify with evidence, could not present to my superiors without sounding irrational. A feeling that lived below logic, in the place where instinct whispers warnings that the conscious mind is not yet ready to hear. I kept thinking about those bunkers, 3 colonies, 3 identical structures, 3 synchronized self-destructions timed to the microsecond. That was not the behavior of panicking civilians. That was not improvisation. That was protocol. That was a system designed to function under exactly the conditions we had created, engineered, and tested, and installed with the expectation that someday, someone would come and do precisely what we had done. Someone, at some point in the past, had built those bunkers and placed them on these worlds, and programmed them to activate when orbital bombardment began. Not if, when. The humans had expected this. They had expected someone to come and burn their frontier colonies, and they had prepared for it. Not with weapons, not with fleets, not with the defenses that any reasonable military planner would prioritize. With information, with signals sent to coordinates that matched no known installation. The question that kept me awake that night, staring at the ceiling of my quarters while my fleet cruised toward the 4th target, was simple. What were they telling, and who were they telling it to? I received my answer soon enough, but not before I made the mistake of ignoring the first warning. We were 12 hours from Haldane's cradle, our 4th target, when my navigation officer flagged an anomaly on our long-range sensor array. A burst of energy readings from deep space, far behind us, in a region that our stellar charts listed as uninhabited. No planets, no stations, no registered shipping corridors, just empty void between 2 dead stars. I asked for details. The navigation officer, a young lieutenant named Sorath, pulled up the sensor data and projected it across the bridge's main display. The energy signatures were faint but distinct. Large-scale power generation, the kind that comes from military-grade reactor cores operating at high output. 14 distinct sources, clustered in a loose formation, moving at speeds that our sensors could only estimate because the objects were at the extreme edge of our detection range. Sensor ghosts, I said. Radiation echoes from the dead stars. Log it and move on. Sorath hesitated. Commander, the signatures are accelerating. Sensor ghosts do not accelerate. I looked at the data for a long moment. 14 contacts, deep in empty space, accelerating in a direction that, if maintained, would bring them across our previous course within 30 hours. They were behind us. Whatever they were not between my fleet and our next target. They were not a threat to my mission timeline. Log it, I said again. Continue to Haldane's cradle. Sorath logged it. We continued. And behind us, in the dark between dead stars, 14 shapes that had been sleeping for 80 years stretched their ancient limbs and began to move with purpose for the first time since the humans had last made war upon each other. I did not know this yet. I did not know what I had awakened. I did not know that the bunkers on those 3 colonies had not sent a message to Earth. They had sent a message to something much closer and much older. Something that did not need orders from any living commander, because it had been given its orders 8 decades ago, and had been waiting, with the infinite patience of a machine, for someone foolish enough to trigger them. I was that fool. And by the time I understood what I had done, my fleet was already dying. The silence of Haldane's cradle was worse than anything I had experienced in my career, worse than combat, worse than the tense hours before a battle when you know the enemy is out there but cannot see them, worse than the quiet that follows a defeat when the communication channels go still, one by one, as ships stop answering. We arrived in orbit expecting another routine bombardment. My gunnery officers had their firing solutions preloaded. My shield operators had their defensive screens calibrated to the same settings that had proved more than adequate against the feeble ground-based resistance we had encountered at the previous 3 targets. Every system was primed and ready to deliver the same efficient devastation we had brought to 3 worlds before this one. But when our sensors swept the colony below, they found nothing to shoot at. The colony was empty. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Not under evacuation. Empty. Every human was gone. The structures stood intact, power systems still humming on standby, atmospheric processors still cycling breathable air through the habitat domes. Cargo shuttles sat on their landing pads with their hatches sealed, and their navigation systems still warm. Ground vehicles were parked in neat rows outside the mining complex. In the residential sectors, our scans detected meals still warm on dining tables, beverages still steaming in cups, personal items arranged in the living quarters as if their owners had simply stood up in the middle of their daily routines and walked out the door. But there were no people, not one. No evacuation shuttles had launched. No distress signals had been sent. The colony's communication array was intact and fully operational, but it was transmitting nothing. Haldane's cradle had not been attacked or abandoned in haste. It had been emptied with deliberate, calm, surgical precision, and whoever had organized the evacuation had done so recently enough that the food had not yet gone cold. "Commander," Keth said from her station, her voice carefully controlled in a way that told me she was working very hard to keep it that way. "You need to see this." I crossed the bridge to her console. She had patched into the feed from a ground reconnaissance drone that we had sent to survey the colony's central administrative hub. The drone's camera was focused on the main wall of the hub's reception area, a broad expanse of polished metal that served as the colony's public information display. Someone had scratched 4 words into that wall. Not in human script. In Dralith trade script, the simplified version of our written language that was used in commercial exchanges across the galactic community. Every officer on my bridge could read it without translation. "You should have stopped." The bridge went quiet. Not the quiet of discipline or focus, but the quiet of something deeper and more primal, fear. My officers stared at those 4 words on the display screen, and something shifted behind their eyes, something that years of training and the weight of rank could not fully suppress. These were soldiers who had followed me through 8 years of successful campaigns without flinching. They had faced enemy fleets and planetary defenses, and the chaos of close-quarters combat, without losing their composure. But 4 words scratched into a wall on an empty world, written in their own language by an enemy who had known they were coming, undid something that weapons fire had never touched. I felt it too. Those words were not a plea. They were not a protest, or a threat, or an expression of anger. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who already knows what happens next. The humans had known we were coming. They had evacuated their people before we arrived. And they had left a message carved in our own language, not because they wanted us to understand a threat, but because they wanted us to understand that the threat was already in motion, and nothing we did from this point forward would change what was about to happen. Keth requested a private meeting. I granted it, and we moved to the tactical planning room adjacent to the bridge, where the sounds of the ship's operating systems were muffled, and we could speak without being overheard. She began without preamble, and I could tell from the set of her jaw and the rigid posture of her body that she had been preparing this briefing since long before Haldane's cradle. I have been researching human military history in the Galactic Archive, specifically their internal conflicts from the period they call the Terran Consolidation Wars, approximately 80 standard years ago. I knew the broad outlines. Before humanity unified under a single governing structure, they had fought several devastating wars among themselves. The Consolidation Wars were the last and largest of these conflicts, a series of campaigns that had consumed nearly a decade and involved military forces of a scale that most galactic species found difficult to comprehend. Entire solar systems had been contested. Fleets numbering in the hundreds had clashed above worlds that still bore the scars of those battles. The wars had ended with the formation of the Terran Combined Authority, and humanity had been largely peaceful in their external relations ever since. During the final phase of those wars, Keth continued, the largest human faction developed a defensive doctrine designated Contingency 7. It was designed as a last resort system to protect critical territory against overwhelming attack. The doctrine involved the construction and deployment of autonomous deep space defense platforms. Massive warships, Commander. Each one, approximately 3 kilometers in length, equipped with combat-grade artificial intelligence and self-sustaining power systems capable of operating for centuries without maintenance. They were built to operate without any crew, to fight without orders from any living officer, and to maintain themselves indefinitely in a dormant state until activated by a specific trigger. She paused, and I could see the tension in the way she held her data tablet, both hands gripping the edges hard enough to blanch her knuckles, as if she was anchoring herself against the weight of what she was about to say. The humans called them the sleeping giants. I asked the obvious question. If these platforms existed, why had they not been mentioned in any of the intelligence briefings that preceded our campaign? Why had the Dominion's strategic analysts not identified them as a potential threat? Why had Grand Admiral Drael not factored them into the operational planning? Keth's answer was not reassuring. Because the official records indicate that Contingency 7 was decommissioned after the Consolidation Wars ended. The platforms were deemed too dangerous to remain active during peacetime, too powerful and too autonomous to be trusted, without an active conflict to justify their existence. The human government ordered them shut down and placed in indefinite dormancy. Not dismantled, not destroyed, not stripped of their weapons or drained of their fuel, simply turned off, put to sleep. The cost of decommissioning them properly, of dismantling 200 warships scattered across deep space, was deemed prohibitive, so they left them where they were. And the bunkers, I said, the cold in my chest spreading outward until I could feel it in my hands. And the ones that self-destructed on the colonies we hit. Keth nodded slowly. I believe they were activation relays, part of the Contingency 7 network. Each one was designed to send a single signal in the event of an attack on the colony it was attached to, and that signal was not directed at Earth or any human military installation. It was directed at the dormant platforms themselves. You are telling me, I said, and my voice was very steady because I was working very hard to keep it that way, that by bombarding those colonies, we sent a wake-up call to a fleet of autonomous warships that have been sleeping in deep space for 80 years. That is exactly what I am telling you, Commander. I contacted High Command immediately. The quantum link to Dralith Prime was still clear, and I was connected to Grand Admiral Drale's Strategic Operations Center within minutes. I presented Keth's findings in full, holding nothing back, including the empty colony, the message on the wall, and the sensor contacts that Sorath had detected in the dead space behind us. I recommended an immediate reassessment of our campaign objectives and a potential withdrawal to defensible positions while we evaluated the scope of the threat. The Grand Admiral listened. Then he dismissed everything Keth had found as human propaganda. Old war stories inflated by decades of retelling and designed to intimidate exactly the kind of cautious officer who would take them seriously. He pointed out that the platforms, if they even existed at all, were 80 years old, built with technology that was now 2 generations behind the current human military standard. He questioned Keth's competence. He questioned my nerve. He suggested that I was allowing an empty colony and a scratched message on a wall to rattle the judgment of a commander who had never before shown such weakness. "Continue to target 5, Commander," he said. "The timeline holds. Do not contact me again with speculation." The link went dead. I stood in the tactical planning room and stared at the blank communication screen and felt the cold certainty that I was being ordered to march deeper into something that my instincts, my intelligence officer, and a message carved in my own language were all telling me to run from. But orders are orders, and I was a commander of the Dralith Dominion, and I had never refused a direct command from a superior officer. That was the chain of command. That was the structure that held our military together. And I followed it, because the alternative was unthinkable. I returned to the bridge and ordered the fleet to prepare for departure. We would proceed to target 5 as directed. That is when the long-range sensor display changed everything. Sorath's voice cut across the bridge, higher than usual, with a sharp edge that I had never heard from her before in 8 years of service. "Commander, priority contact. Multiple energy signatures bearing 047 relative. Range decreasing rapidly. 14 contacts. Repeat, 14 contacts." I moved to the sensor station. The display showed exactly what Sorath was describing. 14 massive energy signatures, no longer at the extreme edge of our detection range but well within it, moving at speeds that should not have been possible for objects of their apparent size. They were in the system we had passed through en route to Haldane's cradle, the system where Sorath had detected what I had dismissed as sensor ghosts. They were not ghosts. They were real. They were enormous. And they were heading directly toward us on an intercept course that left no room for misinterpretation of their intent. Keth was already running identification algorithms. She worked with a speed and intensity I had never seen from her, fingers moving across her console in a blur, pulling data from every archive and database she could access, cross-referencing hull profiles, energy signatures, and weapons configurations against every entry in our military intelligence records. When the results came back, she read them twice, verified them against a secondary source, and then turned to face me with an expression that I will carry in my memory until the day I die. It was the expression of someone who has been proved right about the thing they most hoped to be wrong about. "Commander," she said, "the hull profiles match entries in our historical combat database. These are warships from the Terran Consolidation Wars. Construction date approximately 80 standard years ago. They are Contingency 7 platforms." She swallowed. "They are the sleeping giants, and they are accelerating toward us." The bridge was silent. Every officer, every crew member, every living being on my flagship heard those words and understood their meaning. We had come to burn colonies. We had triggered a system we did not understand. And now, something old, something vast, something that had been sleeping in the dark since before most of my crew were born, had opened its eyes and found us. I gave the order to raise shields and arm all weapons. Then I opened a fleet-wide channel and spoke to every ship under my command. "All vessels, battle stations. We have incoming hostile contacts. Formation Talon 7. Defensive spread. Prepare for engagement." 42 warships pivoted in the dark and turned their guns toward something they could not yet see but could already feel. the way prey feels the shadow of a predator before it strikes. The first sleeping giant emerged from the dark at a distance of 12,000 kilometers, and my sensors struggled to process what they were seeing. The thing was enormous, nearly 3 kilometers from bow to stern, a jagged silhouette of armored hull plating and weapons arrays that looked like nothing in the modern warship design catalogs. It was angular where modern ships were sleek, brutal where modern ships were elegant, covered in the scars and pitting of 8 decades of exposure to vacuum and cosmic radiation. Deep gouges ran along its flanks where micrometeorites had struck over the decades, and the hull plating was discolored in patches where radiation had baked the metal into different hues. Its running lights were dark. Its identification beacons were silent. No life signs registered on our biological scanners. No atmospheric readings suggested the presence of breathable air within its compartments. No crew. It was a machine, a weapon the size of a small city, built by humans to kill other humans during the bloodiest conflict in their history. And it had been drifting in the void for 80 years, waiting for exactly this moment. 13 more followed it out of the dark, spreading into a formation that my tactical officer identified as a modified crescent, a pattern designed to envelop an enemy fleet from multiple angles while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. They moved with a precision that should have been impossible for ships of their size, each one adjusting its position relative to the others in real time, without any detectable communication signals passing between them, without visible coordination protocols, as if they shared a single mind distributed across 14 ancient hulls. I did not wait for them to fire first. In combat, hesitation is death, and whatever these things were, they had positioned themselves between my fleet and our primary escape vector with a deliberateness that left no doubt about their intentions. I gave the order to engage. All batteries, open fire. Concentrate on the lead contact. Destroy it before the others close range. 42 warships fired simultaneously. The space between my fleet and the first giant erupted with energy lances, kinetic slugs, and plasma torpedoes, a wall of destructive force that turned the darkness into a cascade of blinding light. Thousands of individual weapon systems discharged in a coordinated volley that should have overwhelmed any shield system and reduced any hull to molten fragments. It was the heaviest barrage my fleet had ever delivered, more concentrated firepower than most species in the galaxy could muster, with their entire combined navies. The giant's shields held for 4 seconds. Then they failed, and our fire began striking its armored hull directly. I watched through the tactical display as our weapons carved furrows in the ancient plating, blasting chunks of metal and composite material into the void in tumbling arcs of glowing debris. We were hurting it. The damage was real and significant. Armor plating peeled away under the sustained fire. Sensor arrays shattered. Secondary systems vented atmosphere from breached compartments that had held nothing but vacuum for 8 decades. Then the giant fired back. I did not recognize the weapon. My tactical database had no entry for it, no classification, no profile, no historical reference. A pulse of energy, brilliant white at its core and ringed with a shimmer that my optical sensors could not properly resolve, leaped from the giant's forward battery and crossed 12,000 kilometers in less time than it takes to draw a breath. It struck my heavy cruiser Dominion's reach amidships, and the ship did not explode. It broke. The energy pulse hit the cruiser's hull, and the metal simply came apart, not melting, not fragmenting, not behaving in any way that my understanding of weapons physics could account for. The molecular bonds that held the ship's structure together seemed to dissolve simultaneously across the entire impact area, as if something had found every weld, every bolt, every atomic connection, and negated them all at once. The Dominion's reach split into 3 pieces along its primary structural beams, each piece tumbling away from the others in a slowly expanding cloud of venting atmosphere and drifting debris. 1,200 crew, gone in a single shot from a weapon that was older than their parents. The bridge of my flagship went still. I heard someone gasp behind me. I heard a junior officer whisper a prayer to the ancestors, in a voice that was trying very hard not to break. I heard the quiet hum of our shield generators and the steady pulse of our sensor array, and, beneath it all, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, steady and insistent, a biological clock counting down seconds that suddenly felt very precious. "All ships, evasive maneuvers," I ordered. "Break formation. Do not present a static target. Keep moving." My fleet scattered, and the battle became a thing that I struggle to describe even now, 6 months later, with the clarity of hindsight and the distance of a prison cell between me and the events of that day. The sleeping giants did not fight like any enemy I had ever faced. They had no crew to tire, no morale to break, no fear to exploit. They moved through the combat space with mechanical precision, each one independently tracking multiple targets with its sensor arrays, firing with a rhythm that never varied, never hesitated, never wasted a shot on a target that had already been neutralized or was outside optimal engagement range. Their weapons were devastating, but what made them truly terrifying was their coordination. 14 ships moving as one organism, covering each other's blind spots, herding my vessels into converging fields of fire, cutting off escape routes with the methodical patience of predators who know their prey cannot outrun them and see no reason to hurry. I watched my tactical display and tried to find a pattern, a weakness, an exploitable gap in their coordination that I could drive my ships through. Every commander faces a moment in combat when the shape of the battle reveals itself, when the chaos resolves into something comprehensible, and you can see the path to victory, or at least survival. I was looking for that moment. I searched for it with every analytical tool my training had given me, every tactical instinct I had developed across 8 years of command. It never came. My ships fought well. I will say that without reservation or qualification. The crews of the Dralith Dominion strike fleet performed their duties with courage and skill that deserved a better outcome than the one they received. They engaged targets that outmassed them by a factor of 10, pushing their weapon systems beyond rated capacity until the heat sinks glowed and the power conduits threatened to melt. They executed evasive maneuvers that would have earned commendations in any other engagement, threading their ships through lattices of weapons fire with the precision of artists. My gunners scored hits that tore chunks from ancient hulls. My engineers kept damaged systems running through improvised repairs that bordered on miraculous. My pilots found angles and vectors that the giants' predictive algorithms had not anticipated, buying precious seconds of survival through sheer ingenuity. It was not enough. The giants absorbed our fire with a resilience that defied comprehension. When we damaged one, it did not slow down or disengage. It rerouted power from non-essential systems and continued fighting at full capacity, its combat AI prioritizing weapons and propulsion over everything else. When we destroyed a weapons array on one giant's port side, it rotated without hesitation to present its starboard batteries, maintaining continuous fire throughout the maneuver. When we crippled the engines of the third giant in the formation, it used its attitude thrusters to keep its guns on target, drifting through the battle like some great wounded creature that refused to acknowledge its injuries, still firing, still tracking, still killing my ships with the methodical efficiency of a machine performing its designed function. 14 minutes into the engagement, I had lost 7 ships. My fleet was down to 35, and 3 of those were trailing atmosphere from hull breaches and fighting to maintain basic power distribution. The giants had taken significant damage themselves. Their hulls were scarred and cratered, weapons arrays destroyed, armor plating torn away in sheets that tumbled through the battle space like metallic leaves. But none of them had been destroyed. Not one. They were old, they were scarred, they were outnumbered 3-1, and they were winning with a margin that grew wider with every minute that passed. Keth reached me on the internal communication channel, her voice barely audible above the sound of our own weapons firing. "Commander, one of the giants is broadcasting." I switched to the frequency she indicated. Static at first, harsh and layered, then a voice that was not a voice. A flat synthetic tone speaking in a language I did not understand, precise and mechanical, devoid of any inflection or emotion. Keth's translation software took 2 seconds to process it, and then the words appeared on my display in Dralith script. Contingency Doctrine 7 activated. Threat classification. Hostile sovereign. Engagement protocol. Total denial of contested space. No quarter. No negotiation. No withdrawal. No quarter. No negotiation. No withdrawal. Those were not the words of a weapon. Those were the words of a sentence. A judgment rendered 80 years ago by humans who had looked into the future and decided that whatever came for their worlds would not be reasoned with, would not be bargained with, would not be given the opportunity to regroup and try again. The giants did not care who we were. They did not care why we had come. They did not care about our politics, our grievances, our strategic objectives, or our chain of command. They had one function, and they were performing it with the cold perfection of machines that had been built for this single purpose and nothing else. I realized, in that moment, the depth of the miscalculation that Grand Admiral Drayle had made, that I had made, that the entire Dominion military establishment had made when they planned this campaign. We had evaluated the human colonies as targets. We had assessed their defenses, their populations, their economic value. We had calculated the cost of the offensive in ships and supplies and political capital. But we had never asked the one question that mattered. What happens after we attack? 20 minutes in. 12 ships lost, the formation was fracturing. Individual captains making independent decisions, as the coordinated battle plan collapsed, under relentless pressure from enemies that never tired and never hesitated. I tried to reform my fleet, to concentrate fire on a single giant, and overwhelm it through sheer volume. We focused everything on the nearest target, every ship that could bring weapons to bear firing continuously without pause, pouring energy and metal into a single 3-kilometer hull until the space around it glowed white with the heat of our combined barrage. It took 8 minutes of sustained fire from over 20 warships to bring down the first giant. The machine fought until the very end, firing its remaining weapons even as its hull disintegrated around the reactor core, even as the armor plating peeled away in great sheets, even as the structural framework that held it together buckled and warped under forces that exceeded every design tolerance by orders of magnitude. When the reactor went critical, the explosion was bright enough to blank our sensors for 3 full seconds. When the display cleared, the giant was gone, replaced by an expanding cloud of debris that stretched across 40 kilometers of space, a slowly dissipating memorial to something that had refused to stop fighting until the laws of physics gave it no choice. We had killed one, 13 remained, and I had paid for that single kill with 4 more ships. Their crews lost in the time it took to concentrate our fire on a single target, while the other giants were free to hunt without opposition. 30 minutes. 19 ships lost from my original 42, more than half my fleet, gone. The survivors were damaged, their crews exhausted, their ammunition depleted to levels that our supply officers had never planned for, because no one had imagined a sustained engagement of this intensity. The giants showed no sign of fatigue, no sign of depleting their own resources, no sign that the loss of one of their number had any effect on the remaining 13, beyond a minor adjustment of their formation to close the gap. I made the only decision I could make, the decision that any commander makes when the battle is lost beyond recovery, and the only question remaining is how many of your people you can save from the wreckage of a plan that should never have been executed. All ships, disengage. Emergency jump, rally point Theta 7. Get out now. My fleet broke contact and ran. 23 ships, all that remained of the 42 I had brought to this campaign, turned their engines to maximum output and fled toward the nearest jump point. Behind us, the giants continued their advance, but for a moment, I dared to hope that they would not pursue, that they would be satisfied with defending the space they had claimed and allow us to retreat. 3 of them pursued. The nearest 3 giants broke formation and accelerated after my fleeing ships, with an eagerness that machines should not possess. They were faster than anything that size had a right to be, their ancient engines producing thrust that should have torn their battered hulls apart, but instead drove them forward with smooth, inexorable power. They fired as they pursued, their weapons reaching out across the growing distance to find targets among my retreating fleet. I listened on the fleet channel as 2 more ships reported critical damage and fell behind. Their final transmissions were professional and brief, the voices of trained officers who understood what was happening to them and chose to face it with dignity rather than despair. We jumped. 21 ships, wounded and terrified, punched through the barrier between normal space and faster-than-light travel, and vanished from the system. For 3 blessed seconds, I thought we had escaped. Then we emerged at the rally point, and my sensor officer screamed. Not shouted. Not exclaimed. Screamed. a raw sound that no amount of training or discipline can suppress, the involuntary vocal expression of a mind confronted with something it cannot accept and cannot deny. Two sleeping giants were waiting for us. They were sitting at our rally point, engines cold, weapons charged, positioned on either side of the exit vector, with the stillness of ambush predators, who had known exactly where their prey would emerge and exactly when it would arrive. They had predicted our retreat. They had calculated our most likely jump destination based on our fleet's trajectory, speed, and the limited number of viable rally points in the surrounding systems, and they had moved to intercept us before we even made the decision to run. Keth's voice came through the communication channel, and for the first time since I had known her, it was trembling. "Commander, I have been reviewing fragmented human military archives during the engagement. The 14 giants we encountered are not the full Contingency 7 network." I stared at the two new contacts on my display and felt the cold in my chest expand until it filled my entire body, until I could feel it in my bones, and in my breath, and in the space behind my eyes. The records indicate that over 200 platforms were constructed during the Consolidation Wars, scattered across human-adjacent space, hidden in asteroid fields and void corridors, and the orbits of dead stars. The 14 we fought were simply the nearest responders to the activation signal. More are waking across the frontier, Commander. Powering up, orienting, beginning to move. She paused, and I could hear her breathing on the channel, rapid and shallow. And Commander, the giants are not the response. They are the delay action. They exist to pin an enemy in place, to bleed their fleet, to prevent retreat and regroup. They hold you until the human navy arrives. The giants are just the cage. I looked at my tactical display. 17 ships remaining. 2 fresh giants blocking our path. 13 more somewhere behind us. And somewhere beyond all of them, an entire human navy mobilizing with full knowledge of where we were and what we had done. The cage was closing, and I was trapped inside it, with the machines that humanity had built to ensure that no one who provoked them would ever escape to do it again. We evaded the 2 giants at the rally point through a narrow corridor in their sensor coverage. It cost us 4 more ships. 17 made it through. That was all I had left. 17 ships from 42, limping through hostile space with damaged systems and depleted ammunition, and crews that had watched their comrades die at the hands of machines that did not care whether they lived or perished. And behind us, patient and tireless and utterly without mercy, the sleeping giants continued their pursuit. The human voice arrived on my communication channel without warning. No hail, no handshake protocol, no request for acknowledgement. One moment the channel was empty, carrying nothing but the static hiss of background radiation. And the next, there was a voice speaking flawless Dralith, every syllable precisely articulated, every tonal marker correctly placed, as if the speaker had studied my language not to communicate, but to demonstrate a level of preparation that went beyond mere competence, into something that felt almost like contempt. "Commander Sokan, my name is Fleet Admiral Corinne Vasquez, Terran Combined Defense Authority. I would like to discuss your surrender." I was on the bridge of the Talon of Sovereignty, surrounded by officers who had not slept in 30 hours, staring at a tactical display that showed my 17 surviving ships crawling through space, with giants behind them, and nothing but uncertainty ahead. The voice in my ear was calm, unhurried, almost conversational, and it was the most unsettling sound I had ever heard in my life. Not because it was threatening, because it was not. "Admiral Vasquez," I said, because my training demanded that I respond with protocol, even when everything else had collapsed around me. "I am Commander Vathar Sokan of the Dralith Dominion. I am not authorized to discuss terms of surrender." "I understand," she said, "but I suspect your authorization status will change in the next few minutes. I would like you to look at your long-range sensors, Commander." I looked, and there they were. The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in a formation so precise that it looked choreographed, rehearsed, perfected through countless drills until it functioned with the same mechanical grace as the giants themselves. 63 warships, each one a product of modern Terran engineering, sleek and angular and bristling with weapon systems that were not 80 years old but brand new, cutting edge, designed by a species that had spent the last 8 decades refining the art of war, even as they told the galaxy they wanted nothing but peace. They appeared at the edge of the system in a perfect hemisphere, each ship equidistant from its neighbors, creating a wall of metal and energy that enclosed the space my fleet occupied from every direction that the giants had not already covered. And the giants deferred. The ancient machines that had been pursuing my fleet slowed their approach, adjusted their formation, and took up positions on the flanks of the human fleet. They filled the gaps in the hemisphere with the smooth coordination of soldiers who have drilled the same maneuver 1,000 times. The old weapons recognized their successors. They fell into support roles without hesitation, without communication that my sensors could detect, as if the mere presence of the living fleet triggered a protocol that had been written into their programming from the day they were built. The cage was complete. My 17 ships sat in the center of a sphere of hostile warships, modern and ancient, crude and autonomous. And the silence that followed their arrival was the silence of a verdict already rendered. "Commander Sokin," Admiral Vasquez said, "you are looking at Task Force Meridian of the Terran Combined Defense Authority. We have been in transit for 4 days. During that time, your fleet has been tracked, herded, and contained by Contingency 7 platforms that were activated by your bombardment of our frontier colonies. I am now going to tell you several things, and I would like you to listen carefully before you respond." I listened. I had no choice. My fleet was surrounded and outgunned by a margin that made resistance not merely futile but absurd, and the woman on the other end of the channel held every advantage that existed in the known universe. "First," she said, "the colonies you bombarded have already been reclaimed by Terran forces. Elysium Reach, Kovacs Landing, and Briar Shelf are under human control. Reconstruction teams arrived within 48 hours of your departure. The damage you inflicted was significant, but not permanent. Our frontier colonies are designed to be rebuilt quickly. They are modular, standardized, and constructed from materials that we stockpile in orbital depots for exactly this purpose. We expect full operational capacity within 4 months." I processed this. It was not surprising. The colonies had been lightly defended. Reclaiming them once my fleet had moved on would be straightforward for any force that controlled the space around them. "Second," she continued, "Haldane's cradle was evacuated before your arrival, as were the remaining 3 target colonies on your operational list. We knew your attack plan, Commander. We knew your targets, your timeline, your fleet composition, and your rules of engagement. We have known since before your ships left Dralith space." This was harder to absorb. If the humans had known our plan from the beginning, they could have reinforced the colonies. They could have positioned defense fleets to intercept us at every target. They could have stopped the bombardments before a single shot was fired. They had chosen not to. "You are wondering," Vasquez said, as if she could read the thought forming in my mind across the void between our ships, "why we allowed the bombardments to proceed when we had the means and the knowledge to prevent them. The answer is strategic, Commander, and I will not pretend it is compassionate. We needed your fleet out here. We needed 42 Dralith warships committed to a campaign deep in our frontier space, far from your border fortifications, fully exposed and operationally extended. Your Grand Admiral gave us exactly what we required." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I could already feel the shape of the answer forming in the silence before she spoke. "While your fleet was burning empty settlements," she said, and the emphasis on that word, empty, was so subtle and so precise that it cut deeper than any weapon, the Terran Combined Defense Fleet crossed the Dralith border, unopposed. Your frontier garrisons were at reduced strength because your Grand Admiral had redirected forces to support your campaign. He stripped your border defenses to give you a larger attack fleet because he believed the humans would not notice or would not respond in time. We walked through your front door, Commander, while you were busy kicking in ours. I felt the bridge tilt beneath me, though the gravity systems were functioning normally. Every certainty I had carried into this campaign, every assumption about human capability and intent, every calculation that had supported the Grand Admiral's strategy, collapsed simultaneously, like a structure that has been undermined from every direction and finally loses the last pillar holding it upright. You are bluffing. I am not. Task Force Sentinel, consisting of 48 warships under Admiral Derek Holt, is currently in orbit above 3 Dominion core worlds. Vathara, Salk Prime, Dralith Reach. Admiral Holt has not fired a single weapon. He has not issued any threats or demands. He is simply present, Commander, in orbit, visible to every sensor array on those worlds. A quiet reminder that while your fleet was chasing the bait, we placed ourselves in a position where your government has no leverage and no options that do not involve accepting our terms. I stood on the bridge of my crippled flagship and felt the architecture of the entire campaign collapse in my mind, like a building with its foundations removed. We had not been fighting a battle. We had been playing a role in a strategy that the humans had written before our fleet ever left port. Every move we had made, every target we had struck, every system we had jumped through, had been anticipated, accounted for, and incorporated into a plan so comprehensive that our participation in it was never in doubt. The colonies were the bait, lightly defended, positioned on the frontier, too tempting for a species like the Dralith to resist. We had looked at them and seen weakness, opportunity, easy targets that would yield strategic resources without serious cost. The humans had looked at those same colonies and seen a lure, something they could afford to sacrifice in the short term because the structures were replaceable and the people, the only part that truly mattered, had already been moved to safety. The sleeping giants were the cage, activated automatically by our bombardment, programmed to pursue and contain and bleed. They had pinned our fleet in place, preventing us from retreating to Dralith space, where we might have reinforced the defenses that the humans were about to bypass. And the human navy was the blade, not the giants, not the colonies. The living fleet, crewed by officers who had studied our doctrine and our psychology and our culture, and had used all of it against us. Walking calmly through our undefended border while we were trapped on the wrong side of the map, fighting machines that existed for the sole purpose of keeping us there until the real move was complete. Commander, Vasquez said, Grand Admiral Drael is currently in communication with Admiral Holt above Dralith Reach. The Grand Admiral's negotiating position is, as I am sure you can appreciate, somewhat limited. I expect a ceasefire order will reach you within the hour. In the meantime, I am offering your fleet the opportunity to stand down. Power down your weapons, lower your shields. No further action will be taken against your ships or your crews. You have my word. I wanted to argue. I wanted to find a flaw in her strategy, a gap in her plan, some overlooked detail that would allow me to maintain the fiction that we had not been completely and systematically outmaneuvered at every level. But I was a military officer, and military officers are trained to recognize reality, even when reality is a mirror that shows you exactly how badly you have been outplayed. How did you know our plan? I asked. You said you knew our targets, our timeline, our fleet composition. How? Commander, your Dominion Council debated the colonial offensive in open session. Your strategic planning documents were transmitted through communication systems that we have been monitoring for 6 years. Your fleet's departure was observed by human intelligence assets positioned along your border. You announced your intentions, planned them in spaces we could hear, and executed them on a predictable timeline with predictable assets. A pause. We did not need to penetrate your security, Commander. You did not have any. I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, I asked the question that had been forming since I first saw the scratched words on the wall at Haldane's cradle. The bunkers on the colonies, the activation relays. They triggered the giants automatically, without orders from any human authority. Yes, Vasquez said. So the giants would have activated whether or not your navy was ready. Whether or not you had a plan to exploit our campaign. The machines woke up on their own. That is correct. Contingency 7 does not require authorization from any living commander. It was designed that way deliberately. The system activates on a single condition: confirmed hostile action against human civilian populations. The bunkers verify the attack, transmit the activation signal, and destroy themselves to prevent countermeasures. The giants do the rest. Why? I asked. Why build a system that fights without orders? Why create weapons that no one controls? Vasquez was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed slightly. Not softer, but more reflective, as if she was answering the question honestly rather than strategically. Because we built them during a time when we were fighting each other, Commander. The factions that created Contingency 7 could not guarantee that their leadership would survive a first strike. They could not guarantee that communications would remain intact, or that command structures would function, or that anyone would be left alive to give the order to fight back. So they built a system that did not need any of those things. A system that fought on behalf of people who might already be dead. A system that could not be decapitated because it had no head. The greatest deterrent is one you cannot negotiate with. We learned that lesson from ourselves. Now you have learned it too. I gave the order. Every officer on my bridge heard me say it, and none of them argued, none of them protested, none of them offered alternatives, because every one of them understood that the fight was over, and had been over before it began. All ships, power down weapons, lower shields, stand down. This engagement is concluded. 17 ships complied. The fleet that had burned 3 worlds and believed itself unstoppable went quiet and dark and still, surrounded by a cage of modern warships and ancient machines. And then the giants did something that I did not expect. They broadcast. A short signal, repeating on a frequency that Keth picked up immediately. She translated it in real time, her voice flat and hollow, and the words appeared on my display. Contingency resolved, returning to dormancy, duration of sleep, unknown, wake condition, unchanged. One by one, the giants began to power down. Their weapons arrays retracted into their battered hulls. Their engines went cold. Their sensor arrays folded inward like the eyes of something ancient, choosing to close them. The lights that had burned along their scarred flanks dimmed and faded, and the machines that had hunted us across 3 systems began to drift, silent and dark, settling back into the void like great creatures returning to their dens after a hunt. They were going back to sleep. The threat had been neutralized, and the machines that existed only to respond to that threat were shutting themselves down, folding themselves back into dormancy with the same mechanical precision they had shown in combat. They would drift in the dark again, cold and silent, their reactors on standby, their weapons armed but sleeping, waiting for the next signal. Wake condition, unchanged. The next time someone attacked a human colony, they would wake again. And the time after that. And the time after that. For as long as their reactors held and their hulls remained intact, the giants would sleep and wake and fight and sleep again. An eternal cycle of dormancy and devastation. A promise written in metal and energy and code that humanity had made to itself 80 years ago and would never break. I watched them go dark through the bridge viewports. Ancient ships, scarred and battered, fading into the blackness of space as if they had never been there at all. And I thought of the 4 words scratched into the wall on Haldane's cradle, and I understood them now, in a way I had not understood them before. You should have stopped. It was not a warning. It was a kindness. It was the last thing the humans could offer before the system they had built took the choice away from everyone, including themselves. 6 months have passed since the battle that ended my career and began my education. I sit in a detention cell on Dralith Prime, not a human cell, a Dralith cell. My own government put me here because someone had to be responsible for the catastrophe that the colonial offensive became, and Grand Admiral Torvin Drail was too well connected, too politically insulated, too deeply embedded in the networks of power and patronage that govern our military hierarchy to serve as the sacrifice. He was quietly retired with full honors, his war record amended to omit the campaign that humiliated our species before the entire galactic community. The officers who had advised him were reassigned to posts so remote that they might as well have been exiled to a different galaxy. And I, the commander who carried out his orders, who expressed reservations through proper channels and was overruled, who fought a battle against impossible odds and brought 17 ships home, when by all rights I should have lost them all, was court-martialed and sentenced to 12 years in military detention for dereliction of duty and failure to achieve campaign objectives. I do not write this account to seek sympathy or to argue my innocence. I write it because someone in the Dominion needs to understand what actually happened during those 5 days, and the official record sanitized and revised and edited to protect the reputations of those who bear the true responsibility, will never tell the truth. The truth is uncomfortable. The truth implicates people who cannot afford to be implicated, and our government has always preferred comfort to clarity when the two come into conflict. The ceasefire was signed 9 days after Admiral Vasquez accepted my surrender. The terms were comprehensive and, from the Drelith perspective, devastating. All territorial claims advanced during the colonial offensive were rescinded in their entirety. Full reparations were assessed for the destruction of infrastructure on Elysium Reach, Kovacs Landing, and Briar Shelf, calculated at replacement cost plus a penalty surcharge that the human negotiators insisted was standard for unprovoked aggression. The Dominion's frontier fleet deployments were capped at peacetime levels, with provisions for Terran inspection of our border installations to verify compliance, and a formal acknowledgement of wrongful aggression was entered into the Galactic Assembly's permanent records, ensuring that every species in the known galaxy would know what we had done and how thoroughly we had failed to achieve any of our objectives. The humans were not cruel in their terms. I will grant them that much, and I grant it freely. They took no territory. They demanded no political concessions beyond what was necessary to prevent a repeat of the campaign. They did not humiliate our diplomats or parade our captured officers before their media, or demand the kind of punitive measures that other species might have insisted upon after being attacked without provocation. Admiral Vasquez treated me with professional courtesy throughout the surrender process, and Admiral Holt, whose task force sat above our core worlds for 11 days while the ceasefire was negotiated, maintained strict discipline among his crews and reported 0 incidents with Drelith civilian populations. They were, in every sense that matters, gracious in victory. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what unnerves me most deeply about humanity as a species. A species that fights with fury and celebrates with cruelty is understandable. You know what they want, you know what drives them, you know their appetites and their limits, and the price at which they can be bought or broken. But a species that builds weapons of incomprehensible power and then uses them with restraint, that fights with precision and then offers peace without malice, that possesses the capacity for overwhelming force and then chooses, deliberately and consciously and consistently, to hold that fire in check, is something else entirely. It is something that does not fit neatly into the categories that the Drelith, or any other species I have studied, use to understand the galaxy and its inhabitants. During the ceasefire negotiations, I was permitted to visit one of the colonies we had bombarded. It was a condition of the diplomatic process, an exercise in what the humans called accountability measures, designed to ensure that the officers who had carried out the bombardments saw the consequences of their actions firsthand and could carry that knowledge with them into whatever future awaited them. I went to Elysium Reach, the first colony I had burned. 4 months after our bombardment reduced it to smoking rubble, the colony was rebuilt. Not partially rebuilt. Not under construction. Not a work in progress surrounded by scaffolding and heavy equipment. Rebuilt. Complete. Operational. The agricultural domes stood where they had stood before, taller and more efficient than the ones we had destroyed, their environmental systems already producing the first harvest from new hydroponic arrays. The mining facilities were running at full capacity, their equipment newer and more advanced than the original installations. The residential sectors were complete and occupied, families moving through the corridors and parks and communal spaces as if the bombardment had been a distant memory rather than something that had happened 4 months ago. The humans had rebuilt their colony in 4 months, and they had made it better than it was before we burned it. They had done this deliberately, with full knowledge that the Drelith delegation would visit during the negotiations, and the message was so clear that even a child could have read it. You burned it. We rebuilt it. It cost us less than your war cost you. I walked through the streets of Elysium Reach with a human escort officer, a young lieutenant named Catherine Holt who had grown up on this very colony. She had been 11 years old when the evacuation order came. She remembered the sound of our bombardment from inside the shuttle that carried her to safety. The deep rolling thunder of orbital strikes penetrating the atmosphere like a storm that went on without end. The flash of light when the main agricultural dome collapsed in a cascade of burning metal and shattered glass. She told me this without anger. She told me this the way you would describe a storm that had passed through your region years ago. A natural event. Destructive but temporary. Something you survived and moved beyond. Something that shaped you but did not define you. I asked her if she was angry with me. She considered the question with a seriousness that I had not expected from someone her age. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the colony around us, at the new buildings and the repaired streets, and the children playing in a park that sat on ground our weapons had cratered 4 months earlier. Then she turned back to me. "No," she said. "Why would I be angry? The buildings are just buildings, Commander. My family is alive. My neighbors are alive. Everyone I grew up with made it onto the shuttles. The buildings can be replaced. They have been replaced." She gestured at the settlement, gleaming and new. "We do not build things to last forever. We build things to be rebuilt. That is the difference between your species and mine. You build empires, Commander. We build systems. Empires fall. Systems activate." I thought about this for a long time after she said it. It contradicted everything I had been taught about how civilizations function. The Dralith build for permanence. Our cities are designed to stand for centuries. Our monuments are carved from stone that will endure for millennia. We measure the worth of a civilization by the longevity of its structures, and an attack on those structures is an attack on our identity, on the very idea of who we are as a people. The humans do not think this way. Their buildings are temporary. Their infrastructure is modular, designed for rapid assembly and rapid replacement. Their colonies are built from the ground up to be destroyed and reconstructed, because at some fundamental level that runs deeper than military doctrine or political philosophy, humans have accepted that destruction is not a possibility, but a certainty. It is not a question of whether their worlds will be threatened. It is a question of when and how quickly they can recover afterward, and whether the systems they have put in place to protect them will function as designed when the moment arrives. They do not build empires. They build systems. Empires are rigid structures. They stand until they fall, and when they fall, they shatter into pieces that can never be reassembled. Systems are different. Systems bend. Systems break and rebuild. Systems adapt and evolve, and survive conditions that would destroy any fixed structure, because they were designed from the beginning to assume that the worst will happen and to continue functioning regardless. Lieutenant Holt walked me to the edge of the colony, where the new perimeter fence met the raw ground that still bore the scars of our bombardment. Beyond the fence, the landscape was cratered and barren, scorched earth and shattered rock stretching to the horizon under a sky that still carried traces of the particulate matter our weapons had thrown into the atmosphere. But inside the fence, life was continuing. Children were playing in the parks. Families were eating in the dining halls. Engineers were calibrating new equipment with the quiet confidence of people who knew exactly what they were doing because they had practiced for this scenario their entire lives. "Commander," Catherine said as we stood at the fence, "can I ask you something?" I told her she could. "When you gave the order to bombard this colony, did you think about what would happen afterward? Not to us. To you, to your people, to your fleet." I told her that I had thought about the strategic objectives, the resource denial, the timeline, the Grand Admiral's orders and the operational parameters he had established. She nodded. "You thought about the operation. You did not think about the response." I admitted that this was true. "That is the difference," she said simply. "You planned an attack. We planned for the aftermath of being attacked. Your strategy ended when the last bomb fell. Ours began when the first one landed." She was 23 years old. She was a junior lieutenant on a frontier colony that I had personally ordered destroyed. And she understood the strategic landscape with a clarity that Grand Admiral Drael, with all his years of experience and all his political connections, had never possessed. I asked her one more question before we left Elysium Reach. I asked her about the sleeping giants. She smiled, and it was not a warm smile or a cold smile, but something in between. The smile of someone who knows a secret and is deciding how much of it to share with someone who once tried to burn her home. "My grandfather helped build one of them," she said. "He was an engineer during the Consolidation Wars. He worked on the autonomous combat protocols, the AI systems that allow them to fight without any crew. He told me once that the hardest part was not making them smart enough to fight. Any system can be programmed to fire weapons and track targets. The hard part was making them wise enough to stop fighting when the threat was over. She paused. He said the true test of a weapon is not how much it can destroy. It is whether it knows when to go back to sleep. Since my detention began, I have used my limited access to the military archive to research the Contingency 7 network, in as much detail as our intelligence services have been able to compile. The picture that emerges is one that I believe every officer in the Dominion, every member of the Council, and every citizen of our civilization should understand. Because it speaks to something fundamental about the species we chose to provoke, and the consequences of that choice. There are 217 sleeping giants scattered across human-adjacent space. Some are parked in asteroid fields, their hulls hidden among the tumbling rocks, indistinguishable from the natural debris surrounding them until they activate, and the asteroids that had concealed them for decades suddenly have a warship in their midst. Some drift in the deep void between stars, cold and dark, running on minimal power, their reactors barely above standby, their systems in a state of hibernation so deep that they register on long-range sensors as nothing more than metallic debris or dead satellites. A few orbit dead stars, using the residual radiation as a supplementary power source, conserving their own fuel reserves for the day when they are needed. None of them are crewed, none of them are regularly maintained. Human engineering teams visit each platform approximately once per decade to verify basic functionality, running diagnostic protocols, and confirming that critical systems remain operational. And the reports from those visits, which our intelligence services have obtained fragments of through various channels, are uniformly the same. The platforms are operational, their weapons are charged, their AI systems are active and aware, running constant passive scans of the space around them, watching and listening and processing and waiting. 80 years without maintenance, 80 years of drifting in the dark, exposed to cosmic radiation and micrometeorite impacts, and the slow entropic decay that affects all things made by mortal hands. And every single giant that was activated during our campaign woke up and fought at full combat capability. Their weapons fired with the same precision they had demonstrated in the Consolidation Wars. Their shields held against sustained fire from modern warships. Their engines burned with power that exceeded their original design specifications, somehow improved by 8 decades of dormancy, as if the rest had done them good. Their tactical systems executed combat maneuvers with a coordination and efficiency that my best-trained crews could not match on their best day. The humans built these things to last. Not their colonies, not their buildings, not their infrastructure. Those are temporary, replaceable, expendable, designed to be rebuilt because the humans expect them to be destroyed. But their weapons, the systems they created to protect themselves from the worst that the universe could throw at them, those were built with a permanence that borders on the eternal. Built to sleep for 100 years and wake up ready to fight. Built to survive neglect and isolation and the slow decay of time and still function flawlessly when the signal came. That is what frightens me. Not the giants themselves, though they are frightening enough. What frightens me is what they represent about the species that created them. Humans do not build for permanence in the things they love. Their homes, their cities, their colonies are all temporary, all designed to be rebuilt, all accepted as transient structures that will eventually be replaced by something newer and better. But in the things they fear, in the weapons and systems they create to protect against the darkest possibilities their minds can conceive, they build with a permanence that defies every practical consideration. They build their homes to last a generation. They build their weapons to last forever. I have one more thing to report before I close this account. Something that Keth told me during the final days before my court-martial, when she was still permitted to visit my cell and share what she had learned from her contacts in the intelligence community's post-action analysis division. The sleeping giants, the 217 platforms scattered across human space, are the Contingency 7 network. They are documented in galactic records. They are known to exist. The humans have never made any serious effort to hide them, and in some cases, have actively disclosed their locations to the Galactic Assembly as part of their defense transparency agreements. They are, in a sense, a public deterrent, a visible reminder, maintained at enormous cost, of what happens when you attack human civilian populations. But Keth found references, buried deep in classified human archives, that our intelligence services had partially decrypted during the post-war analysis, to other systems. Other contingencies, numbered beyond 7. Programs that were initiated during the consolidation wars and never officially terminated, never publicly disclosed, never acknowledged in any diplomatic forum or defense transparency report. She does not know what these systems are. No one outside the highest levels of the Terran Combined Defense Authority knows what they are, or where they are located, or what conditions would trigger their activation. But they exist. They are referenced in documents that are old enough to be authentic and classified at levels that indicate genuine significance. And if Contingency 7, the system the humans are willing to let the galaxy see, the deterrent they are comfortable showing to every species in the known universe, involves 217 autonomous warships capable of devastating a Dralith strike fleet without crew or orders or any human oversight whatsoever, then the systems they are not willing to talk about, the contingencies that remain hidden even after 80 years of peace, are something that I do not have the imagination to envision and do not have the courage to contemplate. I will end with this. I am not a philosopher. I am not a historian, or a diplomat, or a political theorist. I am a military officer, trained to evaluate threats and respond to them with appropriate force. I have spent my career studying the capabilities and intentions of potential adversaries, and I have never encountered a species that confounded my analysis as thoroughly as humanity. They are not conquerors. They have no interest in expanding their territory beyond what they need to sustain their population and support their economic systems. They are not warlike. Their preferred state is peace, and their diplomatic record in the galactic community is one of cooperation, compromise, and constructive engagement. They are not aggressive. In the century since they joined the galactic community, they have never initiated a military conflict with another species. But they are prepared in ways that defy the logic of a species that claims to want peace, prepared in ways that suggest a deep, abiding, almost instinctive awareness of how fragile peace can be, how quickly cooperation can collapse into conflict, how easily a civilization that trusts in the goodwill of others can find itself standing in the smoking ruins of that trust. The sleeping giants are not weapons of aggression. They are weapons of certainty. They are the physical expression of a philosophy that says we hope for the best, but build for the worst, and we build for the worst with such thoroughness and such permanence that the worst, when it comes, will find us ready. Not eager, not willing, ready. There is a difference, and it is the most important difference in the galaxy. I was a commander of the Dralith Dominion's finest strike fleet. I burned 3 human worlds, and watched my fleet break itself against machines that were older than most of my crew. I lost 25 ships, over 7,000 officers and crew members, and the respect of the government I served. All because a Grand Admiral saw weakness where there was none, and opportunity where there was only a trap so patient and so complete that it had been waiting 80 years for someone arrogant enough to spring it. And the lesson I carry into this cell, the one I will carry until the day I die, is this. Humans do not build weapons because they want to fight. They build weapons because they refuse to lose. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a species that wages war and a species that ends it. The giants are sleeping now, drifting in the dark, cold and silent, their ancient hulls scarred by our fire and the fire of enemies that came before us. They do not dream. They do not hope. They do not fear. They simply wait, with the infinite patience of machines that have been given a purpose and will fulfill it for as long as their reactors burn and their weapons hold, and the humans who built them continue to believe that the universe is a place where something, someday, will try to hurt them again. I pray that nothing ever does, because the giants I fought are the ones the humans are willing to show you. And I am certain, with every fiber of my being, that they are not the worst things sleeping in the dark.